An aspirant can afford to be promising. An emperor must keep those promises.
What is up, guys? Jay Diesel here. Today I am going to be doing a build guide for my Molten Strike of the Zenith character that I decided to roll for Keepers League. I've really enjoyed this character. It definitely took a little bit to get off the ground, but we are firmly rolling now. This character has downed all the Uber bosses, been farming Valdo's boxes, doing the Super Juice Blight strat, done a ton of simulacrums, and overall I've really been enjoying this league. I set a new personal record for Delve. I'm at like 2,300 right now, and honestly I'd love to see if I could try to get 6k by the end of the league. So let's go ahead and jump right into the gear here. So taking a look, our helmet is going to be a Crown of Eyes. This is the premier strength stacking helmet that we have access to right now, specifically due to that last line of text. Increases and reductions to spell damage also apply to attacks at 150% of their value. Well, this ends up being incredibly powerful because of this node right here, Iron Will, which is strength damage bonus applies to all spell damage as well. So what ends up happening is, as we stack strength here, every 5 strength becomes 1% melee fizz, which becomes 1% spell damage, and then that spell damage gets applied at 150% of value to our attacks. And, as you can see here, Molten Strike of the Zenith very much is an attack. Additionally, in terms of a Corrupted Implicit, opted for Socketed Gems, get a 90% cost reservation multiplier. You really want a large mana pool with this skill. This skill is very, very expensive. You definitely either need some sort of either instant leech, mana on hit, or cost reduction in order to be able to sustain the amount of mana this skill actually burns through, given that you're attacking very, very rapidly. In terms of the next piece of gear here, we're going to jump down to the amulet. I'm using a simplex amulet. There are 2 different schools of thought in terms of which simplex amulet you can go for. You can either go for a raw, attribute strength amulet, or you can opt for a double influenced percent increased strength, percent increased attributes, damage per strength amulet. At the high end, they're both fairly comparable. The difference is if you run the Influenced Amulet, you'll have access to be able to use Bound by Destiny, which gives you an additional 15% strength. I ultimately ended up opting for this instead, in part because by using the All Attributes Amulet, it meant that my split personalities got to be life strength instead of inch strength. So that was a little bit of a decision point to be made there. As for the body armor, I am rocking a Sacred Chainmail. I crafted this myself personally. I'm really proud of it. If you take a look, you just want massive armor, massive ES chest piece. The ES is relevant to us because we are a Divine Shield build. So this ES is something that we can recover fairly readily. Additionally, in terms of the mods on this, we're also going to have 8% fizz damage reduction, which is really nice. PDR becomes a very, very valuable stat. Additionally, the 10% reduced extra damage from crit strikes per endurance charge is very powerful for us. So this, in combination with my Lethal Pride, given that we have 8 endurance charges and I get 20% reduced crit damage from my Lethal Pride, ultimately gives us crit reduction. Taking a look at the Eldritch Implicits, right now the most important mod is definitely going to be the 1% less damage taken per 180 strength. This makes you quite a bit tankier. That applies to all damage sources. And I am using +1 to all maximum resistances. This normally would be increased effect of Arctic Armor. However, where my character is at right now, I actually need the +1 max res because it allows me to free up a jewel slot. So I'm going to end up doing that. Taking a look at the rings, This is the best in slot ring combo for this build. Original Sin is an incredibly powerful item. Sets all nearby enemies' chaos resistance to 0. This allows you to do a ton more damage. It's also very convenient and that allows you to ignore map mods like additional chaos res and things like that. None of that really matters to you. The fact it's an amethyst ring is also a nice bonus, given that we struggle a little bit to get chaos res into our build, given that there's so much suffix pressure. Hopping over to the other ring here, we're using Nimbus. The reason we opt for Nimbus in this build is Molten Strike of the Zenith is a projectile build. So when you swing, the balls are going to pass through the target, and then because of Nimbus, they're going to return. But notably, compared to using something like returning projectile support, there is no damage penalty on using Nimbus. So it functions as a 7th link for our skill here. Taking a look at the rest of the gear, we have a Mage Blood. You know it, you love it, it's a classic. In terms of the flask setup we're going for here, we're using a Ruby Flask. This is in order to get us up to that very nice 90 max res. I'm going to have Curse Immunity on this one. I'm using a Quicksilver Flask. The additional movement speed is very nice. A little bit of regeneration. This can just help with any type of degens, poisons, just damage over time stuff that can get around some of our damage mitigation. A Granite Flask. This, once again, is to help pad our armor number, help our fizz hit. And additionally, I'm taking 20% additional elemental resistances during effect. This is actually to help us be exposure capped. I'm not quite exposure capped, unfortunately, but this makes it a little bit less punishing when you do run into mobs like that. For those of you that don't know, there are a lot of mobs in the game, especially in Delve, that can apply exposure, which gives you minus 25% to your corresponding resist. Well, if you're only at 90 res, right, you get hit for minus 25 lightning res, for instance, well, now all of a sudden you're at 65% res and you were taking a ton more damage, so it's important to try to be as exposure capped as you can. I succeeded on the fire and lightning axis, but kind of missed on cold here. And then finally, we're doing a Silver Flask. This is just perma onslaught, 60% increased armor, just help out over here. In terms of this last slot, you could use a Progenesis if you're doing stuff like deep delving, just to make yourself tankier. It also provides chaos res. I've been recently using an Orieth's End because I've been doing a lot of blight strategies. Doing blight, the additional explosion is really, really nice. Worth noting, if you are at the stage in this build where you are running replica Alberons, but you don't have an original Sin, do not run Orieth. This flask will do literally nothing because Alberons makes it so that you only deal chaos damage and the explosions are elemental. So this is something to keep in mind. And then last but not least, you can also run like a Bottled Faith. This can be nice in terms of just allowing you to do a little bit more single target, gives you some regen, but not a bad flask at all. Hopping over to our boots, we're rocking Replica Alberons. This is actually a pretty nice pair that I was able to get. It's got +1 to max endurance and 9% chance to suppress spell damage. We aren't stacking suppress. It's just sort of a nice thing to have, especially with the nerf to suppress. This ends up coming out to 3.6% reduced spell damage, which is like a nice little bonus, but you could definitely go for some other implicit here. You frankly don't even need a second implicit as long as you have 18% increased strength, and that +1 to maximum endurance charges is really what you're looking for. As for the gloves, I opted for Paladin gloves. I did run Warlock gloves earlier in the league, but I ultimately decided that I wanted the little bit of extra armor instead, so I swapped over to these. As for your Eldritch Implicits, we're going to have, most importantly, non-vol strike skills, target 2 additional nearby enemies. This is really, really nice. This makes your clear so much better. As for the other implicit, 3% increased damage per 100 strength. This is a ton of just increased damage for our build. As for suffixes, you're going to opt for an Abyssal Socket here. The Abyssal Socket is really nice because you're able to get kind of a catch-all in terms of what you need. So my jewel here, for instance, I'm using 3% of damage taken, recoup just mana. This is to help with our mana sustain, chaos res, some attributes and all that jazz. And then I synthesized on intelligence and chaos res. This ended up being like a really nice jewel. I was pretty happy with that. As for the other things, your suffix is going to be strength, chaos res. In terms of prefixes, max life is really what you're aiming for. If you want to, you can use Veiled Exalted Orbs in order to try to get a second nice prefix. This isn't necessary. Honestly, you could just like take T2, T1 max life, and then just craft on either damage while leeching. Preferably, you're going to use PDR while focused. I was also very happy in that this pair of gloves, I ended up with 0.2 meters to melee strike range. So this, combined with our Anoint over here, which is Sion's Ambition, combined with the additional strike range from the tree over here, means that we actually have largely screen-wide clear in terms of if you're standing in the middle of the screen, you can hit almost anything on your screen. I really value this just because when you do so much damage, you reach a point where you just want your build to be as comfortable as possible. I'm very big on comfort in my builds. So I actually really enjoy the additional 0.1 meter strike range versus the crafted. As for the extra crafted mod here, this should be damage, physical damage reduction while focused, but we're going to hop over to the weapon real quick and I'll explain why. So as for the weapon, you're going to opt for a synthesized sword. This is kind of like your late game. This is only after Osin. Once you have Osin, then you can just look for a big sword like this. So this is going to have a ton of flat fire with that implicit 3 to 5 fire damage to this weapon per 10 strength. I also got very lucky in that I got one on relatively cheaply with a second implicit, which was increased global accuracy rating. Now, why does that matter? So this ends up being a ton of attack speed, actually, because if we go ahead and we take a look at our ascendancies here, we're taking Undeniable. So Undeniable ends up being 500 flat accuracy rating, and you can also see you get 1% increased attack speed per 150 accuracy rating. If you take a look down here and we look at our accuracy, you can see that we have 11,000 accuracy. So you take off the sword, ends up being about 1,000 accuracy, so you get some extra attack speed on your weapon, which is pretty nice. As for your prefixes, you're going to use Spell Damage Essence here. This ends up working really well with the Crown of Eyes. Flat Lightning, this just rolls the best. Chaos Pen, this is going to be off of a Veiled Chaos or Veiled Exalted. And then, big attack speed. I got fortunate in that I hit 23 life per enemy hit. This gives us a little bit of extra sustain. And then finally, in terms of your craft, it is correct to craft double damage while focused. It goes up to 30%. It acts as a burst cooldown. It tends to be better. I opt for 10% chance to deal double damage because I don't feel like clicking one additional button. It is not correct. If you play this build, I highly recommend just doing the 30% chance to deal double damage while focused. You have one extra button to click. On your gloves, you'll also go ahead and you'll craft PDR while focused. It'll feel great. It'll be awesome. That's not for me. Hopping over to the newest edition of this league, it's going to be the graphs. We opted for 2 different graphs here. So in our first slot, we're actually going to be using a tool graph. So this one's actually really neat. It is the Storming Esh graph. When you activate it here, it's going to call down lightning bolts. Now, why is this so good? Well, when we stand in this, you'll notice if we hover up here, this gives us Radiant Ground. So Radiant Ground makes our damage lucky. So because we are using Replica Alberons here, and it has such a big range, 1 to 80, and we have lightning damage here, this lucky damage ends up being a ton of extra DPS. Additionally, you'll notice here that I have cooldown reduction on it. So, as I've been showing back and forth here, if you use this graft off cooldown and walk back and forth, you will have 100% uptime for this lucky ground, which is really, really powerful, especially when you're doing content like Delve. So this is very, very nice. Additionally, it also has Radiant Ground for a little bit of flat lightning, spell damage, which, as we know, very good with our Crown of Eyes, and then a little bit of regen per endurance charge. So that ends up being 1.6% of our life regen per second, which is pretty cool. Hopping over to our other graft, I opted for a Ul graft here. The hardening, this gives you a small bonus when your life gets low. It can give you an endurance charge, which can be nice if for some reason you're low and you need to get those topped up. Cooldown recovery rate, A little bit more life recovery when it procs, which is good. The big thing, 14% increased max life and 3% additional PDR. Both very, very powerful stats. Now let's go ahead and jump right into the tree. Let's go ahead and jump right into the tree. The first thing we're going to do real quick is take a look at the ascendancies. So as for me, I've taken Undeniable with strength stacking, so this ends up being a ton of additional attack speed. Unstoppable is very nice for T17 mapping. It makes it so that we can run any mod without any real issue. Unflinching is just an additional endurance charge. It gives us endurance charge generation as well. And Unrelenting just kind of capitalizes on that. It makes us even tankier, which is really nice for deep delving. Taking a look at some of our jewels here. So I have a combo of rare jewels. Both these are providing max fire res, life. This one's giving mana per enemy hit with attacks, and this one's giving energy shield. This gives us additional regen of both resources, which is really nice. Jumping over, you can take a look at the cluster jewels. All three of these are going to be fairly similar. The most important thing is that they have martial mastery and martial prowess. The third notable doesn't really matter. We don't actually want to take it. But these two are incredibly powerful given that we are scaling accuracy and strength. Additionally, I have some nice little synthesized implicits on these, but that isn't really necessary. Taking a look here in terms of graphs, we have the Rune Graph of Treachery. This is giving us additional mana reservation to make it a little bit comfier to use our skill. I'm using a Rune Graph with the Warp. This is nice in that it extends the buff duration on, let's say, our Ulgraft. And also very nice for shrines, for certain mapping strategies, which is very appreciated. And in terms of other jewels that we have here, we're rocking a Natural Affinity. So as you noticed probably, as I'm standing here, vines will grow out of my character. And this will give us increased chance to do double damage as they do, which is very cool. And then I'm also running a Balance of Terror. This is actually how we're getting our source of Wither on hit. So you go ahead, you cast Despair, and then you're going to apply Wither on hit. You attack so quickly that you're going to manage to stack up to 15 almost immediately, so there's no real issue there. The Foulborn Red Dream is really powerful in this jewel socket. This is going to go ahead and give us a bunch of additional max life. We used Fire Res tattoos over here, which ends up becoming max life tattoos as well. So that's very cool. I also went ahead and got 25% reduced poison duration. Poison is actually one of the biggest threats in deeper delves. This is a nice way to try to mitigate part of that. Additional strength node here. We opted for Valico here. Ideally, this would eventually become the Purity of Fire Sublime Vision, but that one's a little bit out of my budget right now, so I got to save up in order to swap over to that. But this does provide us with our 90 all res. Taking a look at our Lethal Pride here, I really, really like this Lethal Pride. So we end up with 5%, 10% strength right there, 5% double damage, 15% strength, and then we get 1 rage on melee hit, so this gives us our rage generation. You're going to take Precise Technique here. Our accuracy is so high. This is just 40% more damage. We weren't going to really scale crit anyway, so that was never really in contention. Down here, Point Blank, very powerful for us, given that this is a projectile skill fundamentally. These nodes over here also end up being a ton of extra damage. The reduced projectile speed is very strong. And yeah, this just ends up being a ton of extra damage. Here's a little bit of additional attack strike range. If you don't want to come down here and spend these points, you can either spend 3 points here to go across. This can be better if you don't actually care about the additional strike range. I like it. It feels comfy. You could get more damage doing other things, but that's how I feel about it. Let's go ahead and hop right into the PoB. All right, so let's go ahead and jump into the PoB here. So we're going to kind of go over each of the settings here, explain why they are the way that they are, take a look at both our damage and our defenses. So first off, in terms of the Bandit quest, we're actually helping Alira. This is because we still need the resistances here. After you swap over to the Purity of Fire, you can drop this. It's not really worth it anymore at that point. In terms of our Major God, it's going to be Lunaris. This is really good for delving. Minor God is going to be Tukohama. We're going to be stationary whenever we're DPSing. Additional phys damage reduction is very nice. Time spent stationary. For DPSing, you're going to be stationary, so it's at least 1. You fully ramp after 5 seconds. This number is going to affect both our DPS as well as our tankiness, specifically because of the natural affinity that we discussed earlier, which is 2% chance to deal double damage per vine and 1% less damage taken per vine. So that's going to be pretty noteworthy. We do have frenzy charges off of Blood Rage. We're not going to have frenzy charges for bosses. That is worth noting. I have no way to generate frenzy charges against bosses like Ubers. It's not really necessary though. We do use endurance charges, life tap, onslaught. This is off our flask. I set rage to 20. We generate 1 rage on hit. You can reduce this to 10 if you feel like 20 is a little too generous. Our max rage is 30. I think it's entirely reasonable to say you have somewhere between 10 and 20 rage. Well, in a mapping scenario, you're pretty much always going to have 30 rage, but I think 20 is a pretty conservative amount to have here. We are always leeching. We both have, mana and life leech. Flask will be active. Here you're going to be in Sand Stance. This is additional tankiness off of Flesh and Stone. The enemy size is medium. This is, if you check here, this enemy size actually does matter simply because larger enemies are going to get shotgunned harder by Molten Strike of the Zenith, while other smaller enemies are not going to get shotgunned quite as hard. Projectile travel distance, this is assuming we are directly on top of the target. If the target is further away, obviously our DPS is going to decrease, especially with things like point blank. But most of the time, you're going to be on top of your target. Wither stacks is 15. We attack so many times per second that as long as you've cast a spare recently, you're going to have this maxed out. And in terms of custom modifiers, damage with hits is lucky. This is actually off our Radiant Ground. We're generating off our Graft. As for the 75% less damage, I actually borrowed this from Connorverse. He has a really awesome guide series that he's done in terms of builds that he's done for Molten Strike of the Zenith. This is actually in his custom setups. I opted to port it over. The damage can be a little bit tricky because you can also see additionally here that if we jump over to our skills, I have this configured for a count of 20. This is taking into account all the additional projectiles from GMP along with the returning projectiles. You can obviously tone this number down if you feel like it's way too much. If you want to, you can see, the hit DPS is, 100 million per ball. If you want to see the average damage here, you're still doing 600k with all the balls going through. You do an absolute metric ton of damage, so it doesn't necessarily matter. I can say, having played several builds that do in the hundreds of millions, this definitely is on a completely different level of damage. Taking a look at our skills here, Molten Strike of the Zenith is going to be supported by Awaken GMP. This is for a ton of projectiles. Volatility is very good because we're doing chaos damage, so we have a low minimum of 1 and a high maximum. Slower projectiles, this just ends up being a ton more damage. Awaken Multi-Strike, ton more damage. Void Manip, we're doing chaos damage. I have Leap Slam with faster attacks and Fortify. Fortify is not actually going to proc very often in Delve, but it's really nice for doing T17 maps, follow those boxes, that type of stuff. Blood Rage, Mark on Hit, and a Sniper's Mark together. Despair, we do have to manually cast this ourselves. As for our chest setup, this is actually something that I borrowed from Steve, and I really like this quite a bit. It's a Mortal Call with cast when damage taken. You've got Sigil of Power. This isn't even really factored in. This is actually a ton more damage when you get your full stages on it. A Mortal Call with the more duration enhance actually has really nice uptime. This ends up being about 46% uptime, which is not, perfect, but it's going to be active a lot of the time. Even without a Mortal Call up, our LE max hit and Fizz max hit is still quite good, so I really can't complain too much on that. Jumping down, we also have Arctic Armor, Flesh and Stone, Purity of Elements, and Vitality. Purity of Elements is also benefiting us in terms of the Watcher's Eye we get to use. That's an additional 50% Chaos Res that we have sorted through this. And also our Elemental Ailment Immunity. As for our defenses, we are quite tanky. Our regen is quite solid here. We're regenning almost 1100 health a second. But yeah. Overall, the build is quite tanky. It does a ton of damage, and I really couldn't ask for more. And that wraps things up. So I really appreciate if you guys made it this far into this video. If you learned something or you just enjoyed hearing about the character, if you could drop a like, comment, subscribe, all that jazz. But overall, stay safe, stay healthy, and I hope you enjoy your holidays. All right. Talk to you later, guys.